The Galactic Council had existed for 12,000 years before humanity sent its first probe beyond the edge of their solar system. In that time, 17 species had risen to join the community of starfaring civilizations, each bringing their own customs, technologies, and philosophies to the Great Assembly. War, as the elder races knew it, had become a refined art. Conflicts were settled through elaborate displays of force, carefully choreographed battles where losses were minimal and honor was paramount. The Vrex, a species of crystalline beings who communicated through light patterns, were considered the finest warriors in known space. Their military academies trained officers for decades in the proper forms of engagement, the correct positioning of fleets, and the ancient protocols that governed combat between civilized peoples. When the humans arrived, the Council welcomed them with cautious optimism. They were a young species, barely 300 years into their space age, piloting ships that seemed crude compared to the sleek vessels of established powers. Ambassador Chen stood before the Council for the first time, a woman of middle age with dark hair streaked with gray and eyes that seemed to take in everything. She spoke of peace, of trade, of cultural exchange. The Council members nodded approvingly. Here was a species that understood its place, that recognized the natural order of things. The Vrex representative, a being named Crystalline Thought in Motion, offered to share some basic military text with the humans, as was customary for new members. It was a gesture of goodwill, a way to ensure that even newcomers understood the rules of engagement should conflict ever arise. Chen accepted with grace and thanks. She returned to human space with data cores full of tactical manuals, fleet formations, and the elaborate codes of conduct that governed warfare among the stars. The Council congratulated itself on another successful integration. In 5 years, they expected humanity to send their first officers to the prestigious War College on Vrex Prime. In 10 years, humans might even participate in one of the ceremonial border disputes that occasionally flared up between the younger races, learning firsthand how civilized beings conducted military affairs. Everything proceeded according to plan for exactly 18 months. The trouble began with the Krell, a reptilian species known for their aggressive territorial expansion. They had been pressuring the Soturi, a peaceful aquatic race, to seed a system rich in rare minerals. This was not unusual. The Soturi would resist for a time, following the proper protocols. The Krell would demonstrate their superior force through a series of formal engagements. Eventually, arbitrators from the Council would negotiate a settlement, and the Krell would gain perhaps half of what they wanted. Both sides would claim victory, honor would be satisfied, and life would continue. But the Soturi had recently signed a mutual defense pact with humanity. It was a minor agreement, barely noticed by most Council members. The humans had little to offer militarily, but they had been generous with food production technology, and the Soturi were grateful. When Krell warships entered the disputed system, they found Soturi vessels arrayed in the traditional defensive formation, just as expected. But behind the Soturi fleet sat 3 human ships. They were small things, ungainly compared to the sweeping lines of Krell dreadnoughts. The Krell commander, a veteran named Serac, opened a channel to issue the customary challenge. He would allow the Soturi time to prepare, as was proper. Battle would commence at the agreed-upon hour in the designated combat zone, using approved weapons only. Serac had fought dozens of such engagements. He knew every move, every counter-move. This would be a simple matter of demonstrating superiority until the humans in Soturi recognized the inevitable outcome. The Soturi commander began his response, but a human voice cut across the channel. It was Captain Rivera of the ESS Valor, one of the 3 human ships present. Her tone was professional but carried an edge that made Serac's scales itch. She asked if the Krell intended to attack. Serac was confused by the question. Of course they intended to engage. That was the purpose of this entire gathering. He explained, with some condescension, that battle would commence in 6 hours, after both sides had completed proper preparations. Rivera asked why they should wait. Serac almost laughed. She clearly didn't understand the basics of civilized warfare. He began to explain the importance of proper protocol, of allowing both sides to demonstrate their honor through preparation and formal engagement. Rivera interrupted him. She said that if the Krell were hostile, then they were already at war. She asked one more time if Serac intended to attack her allies. Serac confirmed that yes, the Krell claimed this system by right of strength. He was beginning to explain the legal precedents when the human ships moved. They didn't glide into formation. They didn't power up their shields in the elegant manner of proper military vessels. They simply accelerated, faster than anything Serac had ever seen from ships that size, and opened fire. There was no warning klaxon, no formal declaration, no ceremonial first shot. The humans just attacked. Serac's dreadnought rocked under the impact of missiles that came from angles that should have been impossible. Human fighters, tiny craft barely larger than shuttles, swarmed between his ships like insects, moving in patterns that seemed random but devastated his carefully arranged battle line. His weapons officer reported that the humans weren't following any recognizable tactical doctrine. They struck and faded, concentrated fire on damaged ships, instead of engaging equally across the fleet, and seemed to target command and control systems with disturbing accuracy. Within 30 minutes, Serac had lost 2 cruisers and a destroyer. His flagship was venting atmosphere from 7 decks, and the humans had barely scratched their shields. He tried to regroup, to reform his lines into one of the 17 approved defensive configurations, but the humans wouldn't let him. Every time his ships began to move into position, human vessels would strike at the gaps, exploiting weaknesses that shouldn't have existed because those formations had been perfected over thousands of years. Captain Rivera offered him a chance to withdraw. Serac, humiliated and confused, took it. His fleet limped away from the system, leaving the Soturi and humans in control. The entire engagement had lasted less than 2 hours. By the standards of galactic warfare, it hadn't even qualified as a skirmish. By human standards, it had been a decisive victory. The council convened in emergency session. Crystalline Thought in Motion personally reviewed the battle recordings, trying to understand what had gone wrong. The Krell were not premier warriors, but they were competent. Serac had commanded fleets for 40 years. He understood tactics and strategy, yet the humans had carved through his forces as if they were training dummies. The Vrek's military advisor ran simulations, feeding the human tactics into their most advanced computers. The results were disturbing. Human behavior in combat was classified as chaotic by every analytical model. They seemed to have no consistent doctrine, no adherence to proven methods. They improvised constantly, adapted in real time, and showed a willingness to take risks that bordered on suicidal. But most troubling of all was their attitude toward the enemy. In civilized warfare, you demonstrated superiority. You proved your strength until your opponent acknowledged it and withdrew, or until arbitrators determined a victor. You didn't actually try to destroy the enemy. That was barbaric. Resources were valuable, lives were precious, and wholesale destruction benefited no one. The humans seemed to have missed this fundamental principle. They fought as if their goal was the complete annihilation of opposing forces. They targeted life support, command decks, and engineering sections. They tried to kill. Ambassador Chen was summoned to explain her people's conduct. She arrived wearing a simple suit, carrying herself with the same calm dignity she had shown at first contact. The council chamber was packed with representatives from every member species, all wanting to understand what had happened. The Krell ambassador was demanding sanctions, claiming the humans had violated every principle of civilized warfare. Others called for humanity's expulsion from the council until they learned proper protocols. Chen listened to it all without expression. When the chamber finally fell silent, she stood and asked a simple question. She wanted to know what would have happened if the humans hadn't intervened. Crystalline thought in motion explained that the Krell would have engaged the Soturi fleet in a formal battle, demonstrated their superiority, and after several engagements and some negotiation, the system would have been divided between the two parties. The Soturi would have retained their colony worlds, but ceded the mineral-rich asteroids. Some Soturi ships would have been lost, but the Krell would have accepted their surrender long before casualties became severe. It was how these things worked. Chen nodded slowly. Then she asked how the Soturi felt about losing their mineral rights. She asked if they had wanted to give up resources they needed. She asked if might made right in the galactic community. The council members stirred uncomfortably. These were not the right questions. Chen continued. She explained that humans had studied the tactical manuals provided by the Vrex. They were impressive works, full of wisdom accumulated over millennia. But humans had also studied their own history. They knew what war really was. Not a game of honor and protocol, but violence with purpose. The goal of war, human war, was to win. Not to demonstrate superiority or satisfy honor, but to achieve your objectives and deny the enemy theirs. If that meant destroying enemy ships, so be it. If that meant ignoring ancient protocols, so be it. The chamber erupted. Representatives shouted that this was barbarism, that might without honor was tyranny, that the humans would tear apart the fragile peace the council had maintained for thousands of years. Chen waited for silence, her face still calm. When she could be heard again, she said something that would be quoted for generations. She said that humans didn't come to the stars looking for war. They came looking for peace. But if someone threatened humanity or humanity's friends, they wouldn't fight by the enemy's rules. They would fight to win. And if that made them barbarians in the eyes of the council, then so be it. The Soturi had kept their system. That was all that mattered. The session ended in chaos. Some species called for immediate military action against humanity. Others urged caution. The Vrex, as the preeminent military power, were expected to take the lead in addressing this threat to galactic order. Crystalline thought in motion returned to Vrex Prime and convened the highest councils of war. They had a problem. The humans had somehow developed combat capabilities that rivaled or exceeded those of species who had been fighting in space for thousands of years. More disturbing, they had done so by apparently ignoring every principle of proper warfare. This should have been impossible. Military science was well understood. There were optimal formations, proven tactics, and established strategies that had been refined over countless conflicts. The humans seemed to know none of this, or worse, to actively reject it. But they kept winning. Over the next year, 3 more species attempted to engage human forces, either directly or through proxies. Each time the results were the same. Human ships would refuse formal engagement, strike from unexpected angles, concentrate overwhelming force on isolated targets, and generally fight in ways that seemed designed to maximize enemy casualties and minimize their own. They used psychological warfare, spreading fear and uncertainty. They employed deception on a scale considered dishonorable. They even used captured enemy communications to feed false information and coordinate ambushes. By any standard of civilized behavior, they were cheating. By their own standards, they were winning. The Council faced a crisis unlike any in its long history. For 12,000 years, the threat of Vrex military intervention had kept the peace. Now no one was sure if the Vrex could actually defeat humanity in a real conflict. And real conflict was the key phrase. The humans didn't fight practice wars. They didn't engage in ceremonial displays of force. When they fought as if their very existence depended on victory. This intensity, this absolute commitment to winning, was something the galactic community had never encountered. The Vrex decided they needed to understand human military thinking at a fundamental level. They invited human officers to their war college, not as students, but as teachers. Captain Rivera was among the first to accept. She arrived on Vrex Prime with a small staff and a simple proposal. She would explain human military doctrine in exchange for permission to observe Vrex training exercises. Crystalline Thought in Motion agreed, confident that the Vrex could learn whatever tricks the humans employed while losing nothing of value. The first lecture began with Rivera asking the assembled Vrex officers a question. She wanted to know the purpose of war. The Vrex looked at each other, confused by such a basic inquiry. War existed to resolve disputes through the demonstration of military superiority. It was a tool of diplomacy, a way for civilizations to establish hierarchy and settle conflicts without resorting to barbarism. Rivera nodded and wrote something on the display behind her. She wrote, "The purpose of war is to achieve political objectives through organized violence." The Vrex officers didn't see much difference between their answer and hers. The distinction would become clear soon enough. Rivera explained that humans had been fighting wars since before they had written language. For most of their history, war had been a total affair. Victory meant survival. Defeat meant death or slavery. Even as human civilization advanced, wars remained brutal, devastating conflicts where entire nations mobilized every resource toward victory. Yes, there had been rules, attempts to limit the horror through conventions and laws, but when existence itself was at stake, those rules often fell away. The goal was always the same: achieve your objectives, deny the enemy theirs, and end the conflict on terms favorable to your survival. This philosophy had shaped human military thinking in ways the Vrex were only beginning to understand. Humans didn't train for formal duels. They trained for chaos. They assumed the enemy would do everything possible to win, including violating agreements, using deception, and targeting vulnerabilities without mercy. So humans did the same. They studied their opponents, identified weaknesses, and exploited them ruthlessly. They used terrain, timing, and surprise to multiply their effective strength. They targeted enemy morale, logistics, and command structure. They fought smart because fighting fair meant dying. One Vrex officer, a decorated veteran named Light Through Prism, objected. This might be effective, but it was dishonorable. How could civilizations coexist if they couldn't trust their enemies to fight with integrity? Rivera's response was simple. You couldn't trust your enemies. That was what made them enemies. Honor was for friends and allies. For enemies, you needed strategy, strength, and the will to use both. The lectures continued for weeks. Rivera covered human military history, from ancient battles fought with bronze weapons to the massive conflicts of their industrial age, when nations threw millions of soldiers and endless resources into wars that reshaped their world. She explained concepts like combined arms warfare, where different types of units supported each other to create effects greater than their individual strengths. She detailed the importance of intelligence gathering, operational security, and counterintelligence. She discussed logistics, the unglamorous but critical science of keeping armies supplied and moving. The Vrex listened, fascinated and horrified in equal measure. Every lecture revealed new depths to human military thinking. These weren't warriors in the sense the Vrex understood. They were engineers of violence, applying systematic analysis to the problem of defeating enemies. But the real revelation came when Rivera finally observed a Vrex training exercise. It was a magnificent display. Two fleets, each composed of hundreds of ships, maneuvered through a simulated star system according to classical doctrine. The formations were beautiful, perfectly symmetrical arrangements that had been perfected over millennia. Each side advanced and retreated in accordance with established principles, demonstrating their mastery of the martial arts. After 6 hours of simulation, the exercise concluded with an evaluation of both sides' performance. It had been, by Vrex standards, an excellent display of military prowess. Rivera asked if she could show what humans would do in the same scenario. Crystalline Thought in Motion agreed, curious to see human tactics in action. The simulation reset. Rivera took command of one fleet, while a Vrex admiral controlled the other. The Vrex fleet arranged itself in the traditional opening formation and began to advance, ready to demonstrate their superiority through proper engagement. Rivera's fleet scattered. Individual ships and small squadrons broke away from the main body, accelerating in different directions. The Vrex admiral was confused. This wasn't a recognized formation. He tried to pursue, but the human ships were moving too fast, in too many directions. He couldn't chase all of them. While the Vrex fleet attempted to reform into a pursuit configuration, the human squadrons struck. They attacked supply lines that the Vrex admiral had left lightly guarded because convention dictated supply ships were not primary targets. They ambushed patrol craft that had been positioned according to standard doctrine. They ignored the main Vrex battle line entirely, focusing instead on isolated units and critical infrastructure. Within 2 hours of simulation time, the Vrex fleet was cut off from resupply, had lost 30% of its screening forces, and was being harried by human squadrons that refused to engage in direct battle. The admiral tried everything he knew, every tactic and formation perfected over thousands of years. Nothing worked. The humans simply wouldn't fight the way they were supposed to. Finally, frustrated and desperate, the Vrex admiral did something unprecedented. He abandoned standard doctrine entirely and ordered his fleet to chase the human squadrons with maximum speed, accepting whatever formation resulted. It was clumsy and chaotic, but it worked. He caught several human squadrons and destroyed them in overwhelming attacks. For a moment, he thought he had found the answer. Then the rest of Rivera's fleet, the ships she had held in reserve, specifically for this moment, struck at his now scattered vessels. The Vrex fleet was destroyed piecemeal, each isolated group overwhelmed before they could reform or retreat. The simulation ended with complete human victory at a cost of less than 20% of Rivera's original force. The observation room was silent. Light through prism finally spoke. The question was simple. How were they supposed to defend against enemies who refused to follow any rules? Rivera considered her answer carefully. She explained that the Vrex were trying to fight a polite war. But war wasn't polite. It was violence with purpose. If the Vrex wanted to survive in a galaxy that included humans, or any other species willing to fight seriously, they needed to adapt. That didn't mean abandoning their values or becoming ruthless killers. It meant recognizing that combat was a problem to be solved, not a ritual to be performed. Study your enemy. Understand their capabilities and limitations. Identify your objectives and determine the most efficient path to achieving them. Be prepared to take risks, to improvise, to do things that seemed unconventional or even dishonorable if victory required it. The Vrex struggled with these concepts. Their entire civilization was built on order, symmetry, and the perfection of form. The idea of abandoning proven methods in favor of improvisation felt wrong at a fundamental level. But they couldn't ignore the evidence. In every recorded engagement with human forces, the species that followed traditional doctrine had lost. Those who adapted, even partially, did better. And the few who tried to outthink the humans rather than simply outfight them had occasionally achieved draws. The galaxy was changing, whether the Vrex liked it or not. News of the human victories and the lectures on Vrex Prime spread through the Council. Some species saw opportunity. If the humans were willing to share their military knowledge, perhaps alliances with them would provide security that traditional defense pacts could not. Others saw threat. A species with such advanced military capabilities and no respect for established order could destabilize the careful balance of power the Council had maintained. Humanity needed to be contained, controlled, or if necessary, eliminated before they grew too powerful. The Krell, still smarting from their defeat in the Saturi system, were the loudest voices calling for action. They argued that the Council had a responsibility to maintain civilized standards of warfare. If the humans wouldn't conform, they should be forced to do so or expelled from civilized space entirely. Ambassador Chen attended these debates, always calm, always professional. She repeated the same message in various forms. Humanity wanted peace, but would fight if necessary, and would fight to win. She offered to share human tactical knowledge with any species that requested it. She proposed joint exercises where human officers could train alongside alien military personnel. She even suggested a new framework for resolving conflicts that acknowledged the reality of modern warfare while still minimizing unnecessary casualties. The Council rejected every proposal. To accept human help would be to admit that 12,000 years of military tradition had been wrong. To change the rules of engagement would undermine the entire system that had kept the peace for so long. And to acknowledge humans as equals in military matters was unthinkable for species who had been fighting in space since before Earth had developed agriculture. So the Council decided on a different approach. They would demonstrate definitively that traditional military doctrine was superior when applied by a species with sufficient experience and strength. The Vrex would engage a human fleet in a formal battle, following all appropriate protocols, but they would commit overwhelming force and employ the most advanced tactics their war college could devise. They would prove that discipline, training, and proper military science would always triumph over chaos and barbarism. Crystalline Thought in Motion would personally command the Vrex fleet. The Council chose a neutral system on the border of human space as the location for this demonstration. They sent formal notification to the human government, explaining that this would be a test of military capabilities, not a war of conquest. Casualties would be limited as much as possible, and both sides would agree to binding arbitration after the engagement concluded. Everything would be done properly, following protocols that had governed such affairs for millennia. The human government accepted. They sent a fleet of 30 ships under the command of Admiral Jackson, a lean woman with sharp features and sharper eyes, who had spent 20 years in Earth's Navy before joining the Space Service. She reviewed the terms of engagement. Battle would commence at a specific time in a designated area. Both sides would be limited to approved weapon systems, and retreat was permitted if one side acknowledged defeat. Jackson agreed to all of it, which surprised many Council observers. Perhaps the humans were finally learning proper conduct. The Vrex assembled a fleet of 150 ships for the engagement. This wasn't just a military exercise. It was a demonstration of power intended to put the upstart humans in their place. Crystalline Thought in Motion chose his captains carefully, selecting only veterans who had proven their mastery of classical tactics. They would execute the perfect battle, a showcase of everything the Vrex had learned over thousands of years of military refinement. On the appointed day, both fleets arrived in the designated system. The Vrex arranged themselves in the Infinite Harmony formation, a complex arrangement that had been developed 2,000 years earlier and had never been broken in recorded history. Each ship knew its place. Each captain understood their role. They were a single organism, moving with perfect coordination. The human fleet looked ragged by comparison. Their ships were scattered in no recognizable pattern, with distances between vessels that seemed random. But Admiral Jackson had accepted the terms, so she would presumably fight accordingly. The countdown began. At the designated moment, the Vrex fleet advanced in perfect unison. Their formation rippled with light as shields activated and weapons powered up. It was beautiful, a dance of war performed with flawless precision. The human fleet moved to meet them, and for the first few minutes, everything seemed to go as expected. The two forces closed, exchanged fire, and maneuvered for advantage. Then Admiral Jackson did something interesting. She retreated. Or rather, she appeared to retreat. The human ships broke contact and accelerated away from the Vrex fleet, moving deeper into the system. Crystalline Thought in Motion ordered pursuit. This was an obvious tactic, one covered extensively in tactical manuals. The humans hoped to lure the Vrex fleet into an ambush, or perhaps were buying time to regroup. Standard doctrine called for a cautious advance, maintaining formation and readiness for counterattack. But crystalline thought in motion hesitated. This was exactly what Rivera had done in the simulation. She had scattered her forces, refused direct engagement, and struck from unexpected angles. Was Jackson doing the same thing? The Vrex commander analyzed the situation, running calculations through his enhanced cognitive matrix. The humans appeared to be fleeing toward the system's inner planets. Their ships were faster than Vrex vessels over short distances, but the Vrex had more endurance. If crystalline thought in motion maintained pursuit, he would eventually catch them in a position where they couldn't escape. Standard doctrine said, advance. His instinct, honed by weeks of studying human tactics, said, wait. He compromised. The Vrex fleet would advance, but he would send scouting forces ahead to probe for ambushes. He would maintain tight formation so the humans couldn't isolate and destroy individual ships. He would fight smart, as the humans said. The Vrex fleet moved forward carefully, screening themselves with sensor drones and patrol craft. They detected no hidden ships, no unusual deployments. The humans seemed genuinely to be retreating toward the third planet, a barren rock with no tactical value. It didn't make sense, but crystalline thought in motion continued pursuit. As they approached the third planet, the human fleet turned and formed a defensive line. Now they would fight properly, or so it seemed. The Vrex fleet prepared for engagement, arranging themselves to bring maximum firepower to bear. This was the moment they had trained for, the perfect battle that would demonstrate Vrex superiority. Then the missiles came, not from the human ships, but from the planet itself. Admiral Jackson had sent scouts to the system weeks before the scheduled engagement. They had seeded the barren third planet with missile platforms, thousands of them, hidden in caves and buried under the surface. It wasn't against the rules because no one had thought to ban it. Warfare happened in space, between ships. Planetary installations weren't part of the equation. But the humans didn't care about equations. They cared about winning. The Vrex fleet found itself caught between the human ships ahead and a deadly barrage from the planet below. Their perfect formation, designed for ship-to-ship combat, was devastated by attacks from an unexpected direction. Crystalline thought in motion tried to adapt. He ordered his fleet to pull away from the planet, to create distance from the hidden weapons. But that exposed his formation to the human ships, which immediately pressed their attack. When he turned to engage the ships, the planetary weapons tore into his rear guard. He was fighting on two fronts against an enemy who had planned this ambush with meticulous care. The engagement lasted 4 hours. By the end, 30 Vrex ships had been destroyed or crippled, and crystalline thought in motion was forced to signal retreat. Admiral Jackson, her fleet largely intact, accepted the Vrex withdrawal and offered assistance to damaged ships. It was a polite gesture after a devastating victory. The council convened in emergency session again, but this time the mood was different. There was no talk of sanctions or expulsion. Instead, there was fear. If the Vrex, the finest military power in known space, couldn't defeat the humans, what hope did anyone else have? Some species began sending delegations to human space, seeking alliances, or at least assurances, that humanity harbored no aggressive intentions. Others withdrew from council affairs entirely, preferring isolation to the risk of confrontation. Ambassador Chen attended the emergency session and made a simple offer. Humanity would share its military knowledge freely with any species that wanted to learn. They would train officers, run joint exercises, and help the galactic community adapt to modern warfare. In exchange, they asked only for one thing: recognition that war was not a game or a ritual, but a deadly serious business where the stakes were survival, and the only rule that mattered was winning. The debate that followed lasted for weeks. Conservative voices argued that accepting human help meant abandoning thousands of years of tradition. Progressive voices countered that tradition was worthless if it led to defeat. Species divided along ideological lines, with younger civilizations generally more willing to adapt, and elder races resistant to change. but everyone understood that the galaxy had changed. Humanity had demonstrated beyond any doubt that they could fight and win against any opponent using methods that seemed like madness but produced consistent results. Crystalline thought in motion broke the deadlock. The Vrex commander requested permission to address the full council, and in a remarkable speech, admitted that the Vrex had been wrong. War was not an art to be perfected through adherence to form. It was, as the humans said, violence with purpose. The Vrex had lost because they tried to impose order on chaos. The humans won because they embraced chaos and bent it to their will. If the Vrex, the self-proclaimed masters of warfare, could learn from defeat, then perhaps other species could as well. His speech changed everything. Within months, human military advisors were working with a dozen species, teaching them the brutal lessons humanity had learned over centuries of conflict. Captain Rivera became the head of a new institution, the Academy of Applied Military Science, which taught alien officers to think like humans. Not to abandon their values or become savages, but to understand that combat was a problem requiring creative solutions rather than a ritual requiring proper execution. Some students excelled, adapting human concepts to their own capabilities. Others struggled, unable to shake the ingrained belief that there were right and wrong ways to fight. But slowly, steadily, the nature of warfare in the galaxy changed. Formations became more fluid, tactics became more aggressive, species began using deception, ambush, and psychological warfare, not as shameful tricks, but as legitimate tools. It wasn't a comfortable transition. Many condemned the humans for corrupting galactic civilization, for bringing barbarism to the stars. But no one could deny the results. The pirates and raiders who had plagued trade routes for centuries found themselves outmatched by merchant convoys employing human security consultants. Border disputes that might have dragged on for decades were resolved quickly when both sides understood that military force was about achieving objectives, not performing rituals. And species that had been considered weak because they lacked traditional military strength found that human-style warfare rewarded innovation and adaptability as much as raw power. The Krell never forgave their humiliation. They watched the transformation of galactic warfare with growing resentment, seeing their traditional advantages erode as other species adopted human methods. When they finally decided to strike back, they did so with careful planning. They assembled a coalition of conservative species, all those who felt the humans had disrupted the natural order. They called it a crusade to restore civilization, to put the upstart humans in their place once and for all. The coalition fleet was massive, drawing ships from 7 different species. It dwarfed anything humanity could field. Even with their tactical advantages, the humans would be overwhelmed by sheer numbers, or so the Krell believed. They issued a formal challenge, which Ambassador Chen accepted on behalf of humanity. The location would be Theta Ceti, a system between human and Krell space. Both sides would commit their full strength, and the winner would determine the future direction of the galactic community. If the humans won, their methods would be accepted as legitimate, and all species would be free to adopt them without criticism. If the coalition won, humanity would be expelled from the council and restricted to their home system. It was a gamble, but Chen agreed. She had faith in human capabilities and in the allies humanity had cultivated over the past years. When Admiral Jackson arrived at Theta Ceti with the human fleet, she wasn't alone. 30 ships flew human colors, but they were accompanied by vessels from 15 other species. The Soturi sent their entire navy out of gratitude. The Vrex contributed a battle group under Light Through Prism, who had become one of humanity's staunchest advocates. Even some species, officially part of the coalition, sent observers, who somehow ended up fighting alongside humanity when the battle began. The coalition fleet arrived expecting to face scattered human forces that they could overwhelm through superior numbers. Instead, they found an organized, multi-species fleet that had trained together for months. combining the strengths of various military traditions with human tactical flexibility. The battle that followed became known as the Theta Ceti engagement, and military academies would study it for centuries. It was everything traditional warfare was not: chaotic, brutal, and decided by innovation rather than adherence to doctrine. The humans and their allies employed tactics the coalition had never seen, because half of them had been invented during the battle itself. Species that had recently learned human methods found themselves improvising, adapting, and creating new approaches in real time. It was glorious and terrible, and nothing like the clean, honorable battles of previous eras. The coalition tried to fight properly, maintaining formation and following established protocols, but they were facing opponents who had no interest in proper conduct. Soturi submarines, ships designed to operate in their homeworld's deep oceans and adapted for space combat, infiltrated the coalition fleet and struck from within. Vrex vessels executed maneuvers that no Vrex ship had ever attempted, abandoning the perfect symmetry of traditional formations in favor of aggressive, unpredictable attacks. Human ships coordinated everything, their officers trained in managing chaos, directing the battle like conductors leading an orchestra of violence. After 18 hours of continuous combat, the coalition fleet broke. It wasn't a formal surrender or an acknowledgement of defeat. They simply fled, unable to continue fighting an enemy that refused to behave predictably. The humans and their allies controlled Theta Ceti, and by the terms of the challenge, they controlled the debate over military doctrine in the council. Ambassador Chen stood before the council one final time to address the question that had divided the galactic community. She spoke plainly, without rhetoric or attempts at persuasion. The humans hadn't come to the stars to conquer or dominate. They came seeking knowledge and friendship, but they brought with them lessons learned in blood over centuries of warfare on their homeworld. War was not a game or a test of honor. It was organized violence in service of political goals. That didn't make it good or desirable. It made it a tool, dangerous and terrible, but a tool nonetheless. And like any tool, it should be used with skill and purpose. The humans had offered to share their knowledge, not to corrupt galactic civilization, but to help it survive. Because sooner or later, the galaxy would face a threat that couldn't be defeated with perfect formations and honorable conduct. When that day came, the species that understood real warfare would survive. Those that clung to rituals would not. The council listened. Some agreed immediately, having seen the evidence firsthand. Others needed more time, more convincing. But the fundamental question had been answered. Humans were, in their way, gods of war. Not because they were stronger or braver than other species, but because they understood warfare at a level others had never needed to reach. They had spent their history fighting existential conflicts where defeat meant annihilation. They had developed military science not as an art or a sport, but as a survival skill. And now, having reached the stars, they brought that knowledge with them. The galaxy would never be the same. Over the following decades, human military thinking became the foundation for a new approach to conflict in civilized space. Species maintained their own traditions and values, but they learned to fight smart rather than just fight properly. The beautiful, symmetrical formations of the old days gave way to flexible tactics designed to exploit enemy weaknesses. Warfare became less common as species realized that fighting humans or human-trained forces was a losing proposition unless you had overwhelming advantages. And on the rare occasions when conflict did arise, it was resolved quickly and decisively, as both sides applied human principles of achieving objectives and ending engagements efficiently. Some called it the human peace, maintained not through the threat of retaliation, but through the shared understanding that war was too dangerous to be treated as anything less than deadly serious. Captain Rivera, now an old woman, stood in the academy she had founded and watched young officers from 24 species practice human tactics in simulation. They were good, some of them, showing real aptitude for the kind of thinking that had once been unique to humanity. A Vrex cadet executed a perfect ambush, using terrain and timing to multiply her effective force. A Krell officer demonstrated impressive adaptability, changing his approach mid-battle when his original plan proved ineffective. These students would never fight with the intensity of desperation that had marked human military history. They hadn't spent millennia fighting wars of survival, but they understood the principles, and that was enough. Rivera smiled, satisfied. Humanity had given the galaxy a terrible gift, the knowledge of how to fight wars that actually mattered. Perhaps, she thought, the galaxy would be wise enough to use that knowledge primarily as a deterrent, to maintain peace through strength and understanding, rather than to wage the brutal conflicts that had scarred human history. But if war did come, the galaxy would be ready. Because humans had taught them that war was not about honor or tradition or following ancient protocols. War was about survival, about achieving your goals and protecting what mattered. And now, for better or worse, every species in the Council understood what humanity had always known, that sometimes, to preserve peace, you needed to be prepared to fight. Not for glory or honor, but to win. Because in the end, winning meant survival, and survival was the only victory that truly mattered. The humans had been gods of war, not because they loved fighting, but because they understood it. And now the galaxy understood, too.